to the Soundbites video for week 7. Last week with our study of country, we started to initiate this approach which I call striping through history, roughly from the 70s to the present decade, multiple times, looking at different genres as a focus. This allows us to trace the through line of various narratives throughout history more cleanly than if we sort of looked at it as a sushi slice for every single decade. Now, one of the places where this really pays off is, I believe, this week, where we'll be discussing the connections between disco as it develops into house music and techno, and then finally comes to flourish in the mainstream as EDM, electronic dance music, which still permeates the sound of music today. So, without further ado, let's get started. Alright, I've titled this session Feeling the Love, after Donna Summer's famous track, Disco, House, and EDM, but really mostly focusing on disco and EDM. Alright, so to start with this quote. This is a quote by Steve Dahl, a character that we'll be encountering and you'll be learning more about in a documentary on Disco Demolition Night. In the context of interviews about Disco Demolition Night, Steve Dahl said about disco, "Disco is an intimidating lifestyle. It's an intimidating culture, and at some point there it was being forced down our throats." Alright, so why do I start my week on disco with this quote? Well, I think because it's going to help us realize the gravity and the importance with which, first of all, these discussions about aesthetics and musical styles can have. This was someone from the Midwest who really felt like this different sound, this different musical culture that represented a different lifestyle, a different type of urban culture in this case, really was perceived as a threat to their very way of life, their very way of being. Now, the other thing I think it points to is just how influential the rise of disco was, how sort of rapid and how ubiquitous it was on the radio stations, such that it caused people, maybe who were fans more of classic rock or early metal or new age rock, that people who favored these different manifestations suddenly felt like their lives were being invaded by disco and their radio stations as well. So this context helps us to better understand, if not personally relate, but to understand at least why something like Disco Demolition Night and the Disco Sucks campaign might have happened. I remember speaking at one point to one of my colleagues who's a bit older than I am, and who was reminiscing about playing in a band around this time in the 70s, and then just hearing the Bee Gees, hearing the Village People on the radio, and mentioning to me that she felt nauseated whenever she heard a disco track come on the record, and just wished for the good old days where it was just blues-influenced rock and stuff like Woodstock, people like Janis Joplin, or she mentioned that when Bruce Springsteen came out, he felt like a sort of messiah to the music scene, to sort of return music and rock back to its roots. So there are these aesthetic wars between something that's more electronically focused like disco and the sort of performance, live-focused genres like folk or rock and the like. But on that note, there's another dimension to the backlash against disco, one that is very much social rather than just regional or just musical and aesthetic. And that has to do with the kinds of communities and the kinds of social demographics that disco represented. So when we listen here to the quote by music producer Nicky Siano, he reports, "The backlash against disco was anti-gay, but was also anti-women and anti-color, that is, anti-people of color. It was men take back your power." Okay, so that gives quite a different sort of shading or a different flavor on this Disco Sucks movement. Because disco music originated in and was practiced by these more marginalized communities like the LGBTQ community and many black artists and many female artists, that the backlash against disco simultaneously represented a pushback against those different sorts of identities. And so, as I said in the email for the week, music is never just music, but also entangles our various different social-cultural identities in the mix, so that the politics surrounding the acceptance or rejection of different musical genres becomes emblematic of the acceptance or rejection of different kinds of people. And finally, with more of a look towards the present in a video that you'll be hearing from later, this is speaking of Daft Punk's album Random Access Memories. Random Access Memories opens with Give Life Back to Music, a title that seems to be Daft Punk's thesis on the album. They want to bring the lively joy that was disco back into the mainstream. So this sort of seeds the latter part of our presentation, where we'll be looking at the way that disco sort of comes back from being pushed underground as EDM in a lot of ways continues to persist in the mainstream and found finally that mainstream acceptance and success. Although, as I'll talk about then, not without some caveats. But let's go ahead and check out some of the artists that we'll be taking a deeper look into this week. Under the genre of disco, although there are many names and groups we could look at, I'm choosing to highlight Donna Summer, of course, as one of the classic faces of disco, as well as Gloria Gaynor. And although, again, there were many groups, some of them male-led, some of them groups vocalists, I think these two solo black women artists really helped exemplify the way that disco presented, in a lot of ways, a minoritized sound and a face to the genre. Next, in early EDM, early electronic music, we'll be looking at away from the shores of the United States. First at Kraftwerk, a European-German artist group, and then at Yellow Magic Orchestra, a Japanese group. Now, these two groups in different parts of the world were formulating almost simultaneously in history works that would become very influential in the formation not only of later EDM music, but also of hip-hop and rap and the like. And finally, when we look at EDM or electronic dance music proper as it comes to rise in the late 2000s and early 2010s, we'll be focusing on Daft Punk, as well as the DJ Tiesto. There are many more names I could have chosen here, as always is the case, but I'm focusing on Tiesto kind of as an exhibit A or case study of what a great many DJs had done around that time and continue to do to the present day. So with that, let's take a look at the history of disco, which you'll be learning a lot more about in the rest of the week's materials. So disco is a genre that was born from New York's Greenwich Village, which actually Bob Dylan was famous for playing in and writing quite a few famous songs in, I think including The Times They Are Changing. So this was sort of a countercultural and in a lot of ways bohemian expression and community in New York City, especially for black and gay communities in around the 70s. Now this was a time when a gay culture and other LGBT identities started to rise more to the fore, although also experience a lot of social pushback, and that's something that we actually see played out in the history of disco, as we'll see. So the music of disco focused on the purposes of dancing for dance clubs, and specifically in this sort of underground scene of these urban gay dance clubs in the 70s. And so the music was very much produced in this context and in a lot of ways celebrated and practiced by these communities. Now, musically, disco is a genre that absorbed many other musical styles, and within that context started to develop electronic instruments and electronic timbres to a greater extent. Especially the engineer and composer Giorgio Moroder was a big influence here. We'll talk more about that with Donna Summer. Primary artists, at least the ones I'm highlighting, were women, especially black women, and here again Donna Summer and Gloria Gaynor come much to mind. Of course, there are other artists and groups that we could include here, but again, it just goes to show how the face of disco might have looked and sounded very different than people are used to, let's say, with mainstream rock music. Now, in 1973, Manu Dibango's track Soul Makossa was hailed as a disco song that achieved mainstream success on the mainstream pop charts. And it was so successful that it started to drive the sales of these 12-inch records, which were longer and allowed for not only higher quality play, but specifically more runtime than the standard 45 RPM record. So this allowed the music to begin to be lengthened, as you'll learn about in one of the other videos this week. Now, by 1979, disco had achieved mainstream success. It was being played a lot on the radio, having successful hits on the pop charts. You even had, for example, the Grammys create a category for disco to recognize the best disco tracks. But then, at that point, going into the 80s, started to face this extreme backlash. So there was sort of like an organized disco sucks movement and t-shirts that would say disco sucks and be commonly sold. And part of this disco sucks movement culminated in Disco Demolition Night. Just to sort of preview that, Disco Demolition Night was organized by Steve Dahl, who we heard from earlier, in the Midwest. They rented out a baseball field and collected a big bin of records where you could attend just if you brought a record to be destroyed. And then they set off a bomb that blew up all those bin of records altogether, sort of in this big statement. Now, Disco Demolition Night was heavily covered in the news headlines and sort of was emblematic for this pushback movement against disco that resulted in it being reduced in popularity and sort of pushed from the mainstream. So after this brief-ish window of 6-7 years in the limelight, disco was then pushed back underground, where it had initially originated from, but continued to develop in these underground clubs as house music to reemerge later into the mainstream as EDM in the 2000s, which we'll cover the back end of that later. Now, I mentioned that the history of disco itself mirrors the history of what a lot of the LGBTQ community experienced, and one of the sources that you'll be reading really speaks of that. And so during the 70s, as gay and lesbian and bisexual and other sorts of identities began to become more visible, there was much of conservative society, like the Moral Majority, for example, Jerry Falwell and other things like that, that started to really have that backlash and push against the LGBTQ community. So by the 80s, you sort of had them pushed more underground or in the closet again. So that's, again, mirroring what actually happened with disco music. Alright, so let's start by talking about our artist with Donna Summer. Donna Summer is known as the Queen of Disco. She was a frequent collaborator with the producer Giorgio Moroder, who in a lot of ways was sort of the compositional or the engineer producer behind the sound of disco, working with the synths, mastering the records and doing the production, etc. But for Donna Summer, Summer's music was upbeat, mostly in tone, again, focused on dance and an overall positive vibe. But Donna Summer's own life, as we'll see is often a common theme, was filled with these difficult and abusive relationships. At different points in her life, she contemplated suicide, went through chronic depression, and much more. So in this context, her 1977 disco hit "I Feel Love," which was one of probably her most famous collaboration with Giorgio Moroder, became definitive of the sound of disco in its prime, in its heyday. This was a track that employed various synthesizers, sequenced arpeggiators, live multi-tracking with Donna Summer overdubbing her own voice in several harmonized layers, and more techniques which at the time would have been very revolutionary, even if we're sort of more used to that sound by now. Now, Donna Summer's music is also known for being unashamed and unabashed in its celebration of sexuality, "I Feel Love" being a great example. Another that I've included on the playlist is "Love to Love You Baby," which you might notice can be a bit surprising in terms of its sexual subject matter, and so many radio stations consider this to be so risque that they banned the song. Now, last week with country, we mentioned those odd ducks, which sometimes get inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame despite being more of a country artist, people like Johnny Cash and Dolly Parton. Well, it turns out Donna Summer in 2013 was also inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, being cited as an influence on Madonna, Beyonce, as well as the modern EDM genre. So Donna Summer continues to be very influential, although as a recording artist, she may never have really eclipsed her popularity that peaked in around 1977 with "I Feel Love." Now we see a very similar story to Donna Summer with our next artist, Gloria Gaynor. So Gloria Gaynor was born Gloria Fowles, and she broke into the music industry with her album Never Can Say Goodbye in 1975, right around the same time as Donna Summer. Now this album, which only had 3 tracks, was notable for being through composed, meaning it didn't have separations between each track. It was just meant to be heard end on end on end. And so it essentially creates this full 19 minutes of runtime with a seamless track with no intended musical breaks. It's meant to just play into itself. And the longer length time, the long form structure here, foreshadows the move towards the 12-inch record that we mentioned disco was moving towards. Now, 3 years later, in 1978, Gaynor really broke through with "I Will Survive," still her most enduring hit to this day. The track went multiple platinum in terms of its Billboard ratings. It was given a Grammy Award as the best disco song from that year. It sold 15 million records. And its cultural impact is considerable as well. It is considered an empowerment anthem for women and for feminism, as well as for LGBTQ rights, again, with the association with the disco community, although Gaynor herself identified it more with the feminist aspect. Her song "I Am What I Am," released in 1984, also became another LGBTQ plus community anthem. Now, back to "I Will Survive" for a second. Now, when it reached platinum in 1979, this sort of is emblematic of the height of disco's success in the mainstream. So for that reason, the Library of Congress installed it as a cultural artifact. Now, even though it became sort of this larger-than-life track, which so many different communities and types of people identified with, for Gaynor, it was always a very personal, intimately personal, autobiographical song. One about her being brought up in a context of poverty, of childhood sexual abuse, as well as having an accident just a mere 6 months before she went in to record the song that left her paralyzed from the waist down for quite some time. So this was really a survival anthem for just all the stuff that she went through in her life that she was pledging being able to endure through. Now, like Donna Summer, Gloria Gaynor never really eclipsed the popularity, and again, because disco got forced back underground, it's no wonder that their artists sort of suffered a similar fate. But in the 1990s, Gloria Gaynor was popular and prominent in acting careers, in some shows on TV and Broadway, and actually was able to make a return album in 2002 called "I Wish You'd Love." So while she never really reached the height of her popularity in the late 70s and the early 80s, she continued to have a career after that point.